A letter stained with blood and sand arrived one morning that promised death. The crumpled paper held an invitation that would change 2 lives forever. But before that, there would be betrayal, gunfights, and a love capable of transforming the most arid desert into a garden. No one imagined that a simple job advertisement on an isolated farm would unleash the most dramatic events the Old West had ever witnessed. As dawn broke, when the wind whispered forgotten promises across the endless dunes, Claire Smith clutched the letter to her chest and felt the weight of a decision that could save her or destroy her. The rising sun painted the horizon blood red, as if anticipating the events to come. She had fled St. Louis 3 weeks ago, leaving behind a past that haunted her like the coyotes howling in the cold desert nights. Her fingers trembled not from the morning chill, but from the uncertainty of what she would find at Esperanza Ranch, property of a certain Thomas Johnson, a widower looking for someone to care for his land. The advertisement was brief, almost rude in its simplicity. But for Claire, it represented the only chance for a new start in a life marked by loss and disillusionment. The stagecoach carrying her swayed violently on the dusty trails, each jolt a reminder that she was moving further and further away from civilization. The coachman, an old man with a grizzled beard and eyes that had seen too much, spit tobacco out the window and muttered something about the foolishness of a woman alone accepting work on such an isolated farm. Claire did not reply. Her green eyes, the color of an imaginary oasis's waters, remained fixed on the horizon where the mountains rose like ancient sentinels. The desert stretched out infinitely, a blank canvas where destiny would write its story with ink of sweat and tears. When she finally spotted the farm, her heart sank. The main building, a wooden house weathered by time and the harsh sun, stood solitary like a ship abandoned on a sea of sand. The fences creaked in the constant wind, producing a melancholic melody that seemed to echo the loneliness of the place. The empty corrals spoke of better times, when the cattle grazed abundantly and life pulsed on those lands. Now, only silence and dust dominated the landscape. Thomas Johnson waited for her on the porch, an imposing figure who seemed sculpted from the same rock as the distant mountains. His broad shoulders were slightly stooped, not from age, which had not yet reached 35, but from the invisible weight he carried. When Claire stepped down from the stagecoach, their eyes met for the first time. His were gray like the sky before a storm, deep wells of sadness that seemed to suck all the light around them. For an eternal moment, they measured each other. 2 strangers united by chance and necessity. The first word he spoke was dry as the desert wind, just his last name, Johnson, accompanied by a nearly imperceptible nod. Claire replied with equal economy, aware that in the West, words were expensive. Currency. The coachman unloaded her single suitcase, a worn bag containing all her earthly possessions, and departed, leaving behind a cloud of dust that took a long time to settle. They stood there, still, as the sun climbed mercilessly in the clear sky. Inside, the house told a different story. Despite the obvious neglect in some areas, there were signs that someone had tried to keep the memory of better times alive. Hand-embroidered curtains hung in the windows, faded but still graceful. Tarnished silver-framed photographs decorated the cold fireplace. In one, Claire glimpsed a woman with a sweet smile beside a younger Thomas, his eyes still alive with hope. A small child completed the family portrait, frozen in a moment of happiness that time had stolen. Thomas explained her duties with the same brevity of words. Take care of the house, prepare meals, help with the few animals that remained. The pay was modest but fair, including room and board. There was a room at the back of the house, simple but clean, that would be hers. Claire accepted without hesitation. She had nowhere to go back to, and something in that broken man awakened in her, a protective instinct she had long thought dead. The first few days were marked by a silence as thick as molasses. Thomas left before dawn to tend to the little cattle that remained and the horses in the stable. Claire quickly discovered that the pantry was nearly empty, surviving on the basics. Beans, flour, bitter coffee, and jerky made up the daily menu. She began to work small miracles with the little she had, adding wild herbs she found around the house, transforming monotonous meals into something that could almost be called comforting. It was during the first sandstorm that the barriers began to yield. The wind howled like 1,000 demons, shaking the house to its foundations. Claire had experienced storms in St. Louis, but nothing had prepared her for the blind fury of nature in the desert. The sand seeped through every crack, covering everything with a fine layer of dust. The animals in the stable neighed nervously, and she could hear Thomas struggling to calm them. When he finally came in, he was covered in sand from head to foot, looking more like a clay statue than a man. Claire had already prepared hot water and clean cloths, anticipating his need. For the first time, she saw something beyond sadness in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the faint beginning of gratitude. As he cleaned himself in silence, she noticed the tremor in his hands, the exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Without thinking, she poured him a cup of strong coffee, adding a spoonful of sugar she had secretly saved for special occasions. That night, while the storm roared outside, Thomas spoke more than he had in all the previous days combined. He told her about the drought of the previous year that had decimated much of the herd, about the neighbors who had left in search of greener pastures, about how Esperanza Ranch had been his father's dream, and then his own. He didn't mention his wife or daughter, but Claire could feel their presence in every pause, in every lost look towards the photographs on the fireplace. A week turned into 2, then into a month. Routine settled in like the trails the cattle made in the dry earth. Claire discovered she had a knack for handling the skittish chickens Thomas kept in a makeshift chicken coop. The fresh eggs she managed to get were a luxury he had forgotten. He also started working on a small vegetable patch behind the house, fighting against the ungrateful soil to make a few resilient vegetables sprout. Each small victory against the aridity of the desert was celebrated in silence, with a nearly smile from him, or an extra sparkle of satisfaction in her eyes. The ranch hands who occasionally came to help with the cattle watched her with thinly veiled suspicion. Jake Williams, Sam Brown, and Old Pete formed a trio that represented everything most traditional and conservative about the West. A woman giving orders, even indirectly, was something that grated against their ingrained concepts of how the world should work. Jake, in particular, with his waxed mustache and arrogant manner, made a point of ignoring her suggestions on the best way to store hay or the signs of illness in one of the cows. It was Pete, surprisingly, who softened first. On a particularly hot afternoon, when the sun seemed determined to melt even the stones, Claire brought jars of fresh water with wild lemon for the men working on repairing the fences. Pete, with his 60 years and back bent by work, accepted, with genuine gratitude. Later, he confided that his late wife used to make the same drink, and for a moment his rheumy eyes shone with sweet memories. The second month brought subtle but significant changes. Thomas started lingering a little longer during meals, sometimes even risking a comment about the weather or plans for the next day. Claire learned to read his moods in small things, in the way he held his coffee cup, in the angle of his hat when he returned from the field. He still carried his grief like a second skin, but occasionally she glimpsed the man he had been before the tragedy. The discovery of the secret garden happened by chance, when Claire was chasing a runaway chicken that had decided to explore beyond the usual limits. Behind a pile of old wood and rusty tools, partially hidden by a dry vine, there was a small fenced area. Inside, the remains of an elaborate garden told its own story of abandonment. Raised beds, now overgrown with weeds, still showed traces of careful planning. In the center, a rose bush struggled to survive, its twisted branches bearing thorns but no flowers. When Thomas found her there, kneeling among the dead beds, his face transformed. The mask of indifference he wore as armor cracked, revealing a raw pain that made Claire catch her breath. For a terrible moment, she thought he would yell, order her out, tell her never to return to that place. Instead, he simply stood there, looking at the garden as if he saw ghosts dancing among the dead plants. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough as sandpaper. The garden had been Margaret's, his wife's. She spent hours there cultivating flowers that had no practical use in the hostile desert, but that brought color and life to the farm. Roses, wild daisies, even some lavender seedlings she had brought from the east. After she died of fever, along with little Emily, he couldn't bring himself to enter there anymore. The garden died with them, another monument to what he had lost. Claire said nothing. Words would be an insult to that pain. Instead, she silently began pulling out the most aggressive weeds, her hands working carefully so as not to disturb more than necessary. Thomas stood watching for long minutes before kneeling beside her. Together, in silence, they began to clean the garden. It was a work of shared grief. Each weed pulled a small step towards something neither of them could yet name. In the days that followed, the garden became a silent project between them. Claire found some viable seeds still in the shed and began planting. Thomas brought extra water from the well, a luxury in those lands where every drop was precious. The rose bush, after patient care, began to show shy signs of new life. They didn't talk about the meaning of it, but both understood they were cultivating more than plants. It was on one of those afternoons in the garden that the danger began to manifest. Claire first noticed the horse tracks near the back fence, marks that didn't belong to any of the farm's animals. When she showed Thomas, his face hardened into an expression she hadn't seen before. He examined the tracks carefully, following the trail until it disappeared into the hills. That night, he loaded his rifle and kept it within reach during dinner. Rumors about cattle rustlers had circulated in recent weeks. Pete had mentioned that the Henderson Ranch, 15 miles to the north, had lost 20 head in a single night. Sam added that the Taylors had found one of their best bulls slaughtered and partially butchered, a waste that suggested something beyond simple theft. Thomas listened in silence, but Claire noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed on the table. The first real closeness between them happened on a cloudy morning, rare in that stretch of desert. Claire had gone out early to check on one of the chickens that seemed sick when her horse, a gentle mare named Sweetie, suddenly balked. The animal snorted nervously, backing up despite Claire's commands. It was then she saw the rattlesnake, coiled on the path, its rattle sounding the deadly warning. Sweetie reared, nearly throwing Claire from the saddle. Thomas appeared out of nowhere, moving with a speed that contradicted his size. In one fluid motion, he pulled Claire from the saddle while simultaneously pulling Sweetie away from the danger. The snake, disturbed but not aggressive, slithered away, disappearing among the rocks. Claire found herself pressed against Thomas's chest, her heart beating wildly, not just from the fright. For an infinite moment, they stayed like that, breathing the same air, acutely aware of the closeness. It was Thomas who pulled away first, his hands leaving her arms as if they burned. But there was something different in his eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. He checked if she was injured with a gentleness that made her heart ache, his calloused fingers surprisingly delicate as he examined her wrists and ankles. When he was sure she was all right, he simply nodded and returned to work. But Claire noticed he stayed close by for the rest of the morning, always within sight. That afternoon, while preparing dinner, Claire found something on the kitchen table that made her pause. A small desert flower, one of those rare ones that bloomed only after the scarce rains, was carefully placed in a glass of water. It was pale purple, delicate as paper, its petals trembling in the breeze coming through the window. There was no note, but she knew. When Thomas came in for dinner, she was wearing the flower tucked into her hair. He noticed, she saw by the flush that rose up his tanned neck, but neither of them commented. The night brought a restlessness Claire couldn't name. The coyotes seemed closer, their howls more insistent. Even the horses in the stable were agitated, pawing the ground and neighing softly. Thomas made several rounds, checking the property's perimeter. Claire watched him from the kitchen window, his silhouette outlined against the starry sky, the rifle always present in his hands. Around midnight, the dogs began to bark furiously. Thomas was already on his feet before Claire could process the sound. He moved quickly through the house, extinguishing the oil lamps, plunging everything into darkness. His voice was low but urgent when he ordered her to stay away from the windows. Claire obeyed, but picked up the pistol she had noticed in the kitchen drawer, checking if it was loaded. Long minutes passed in tense silence. Then, clear as a rifle, "Shot," came the voice from outside. Someone called Thomas's name, the drawn-out voice carrying a mocking tone that made Claire's skin crawl. Thomas remained silent, positioned strategically where he could see the front of the house without being seen. The voice continued, mentioning old debts and scores to settle. After a time that felt eternal, the sound of horses riding away broke the silence. Thomas waited another half hour before lighting an oil lamp again. His face, in the flickering light, was sculpted in hard lines. When Claire asked who those men were, he hesitated before answering. Jack Miller and his gang. Men he had known in another life, before Margaret, before the farm. Men who didn't understand that some bridges, once burned, could not be rebuilt. In the following days, the tension on the farm was palpable. Thomas rarely left the house, and when he did, he insisted Claire carry the pistol. He taught her to shoot properly, spending afternoons practicing on a makeshift target behind the stable. Claire was naturally skilled, her steady hand and sharp eye surprising both of them. During these lessons, the forced proximity created an electrical awareness between them, each correction of posture, each adjustment of aim loaded with unspoken meaning. One evening, after a particularly silent dinner, Thomas surprised Claire by pulling a small wooden box from a high cabinet. Inside, wrapped in soft fabric, was a wooden comb. He had carved it over the past few weeks, working in the few spare hours, transforming a piece of cedar into something delicate and beautiful. The design was simple but elegant, small flowers carved along the top. Claire held the gift as if it were made of gold, not wood. It was the first beautiful thing anyone had given her in years. When she raised her eyes to thank him, the words died in her throat. Thomas was looking at her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. For a moment, the world shrank to that kitchen lit by an oil lamp, to the two solitary beings who had found something unexpected in each other. She rose slowly, the comb still in her hands. She took a step towards him, then another. Thomas remained, motionless, but she could see the battle in his eyes, desire fighting against fear, need against guilt. When she was close enough to feel the warmth emanating from him, she reached out and gently touched his face. His stubble pricked her palm, but she didn't pull away. It was Thomas who broke the moment, capturing her hand in his but gently drawing it away. He couldn't yet, the ghost of Margaret too present, too real. Claire understood, stepping back without resentment. Some wounds needed more time to heal. She pinned her hair up with the new comb, a gesture that drew a nearly smile from him, and they returned to the careful routine of proximity and distance they had established. The attack came on a Sunday morning, when their guard was lowest. Claire had convinced Thomas to accompany her on a walk to the dry creek, where she sometimes found medicinal herbs. It was a beautiful morning, the rare kind where the desert showed its gentler side. Eagles circled lazily in the cloudless blue. Sky and even the wind had died down to a pleasant breeze. They were returning, talking about the possibility of expanding the garden, when they saw the smoke. Thin at first, then thicker, rising from the direction of the farm. Thomas dropped the basket of herbs and ran, Claire close behind despite his shouts for her to stay back. What they found made the blood run cold in their veins. The chicken coop was in flames, the poor birds screaming in panic. 3 men on horseback laughed while another threw a lit torch towards the stable. Jack Miller, recognizable by his black hat and the scar cutting across his left cheek, supervised the destruction with cruel satisfaction. When he saw Thomas approaching, his smile widened. The confrontation was quick and brutal. Thomas shot, first hitting the man with the torch before he could ignite the stable. The horses inside neighed in terror, kicking against the doors. Claire ran to free them while Thomas faced the others. Shots echoed through the valley, each one making her heart jump. She fumbled with the bolts, her hands trembling, finally managing to open the doors and let the animals escape. When she turned around, she saw Thomas on the ground, blood staining his shirt. Miller stood over him, gun pointed, savoring the moment. Without thinking, Claire drew the pistol she carried and fired. Years of practice hunting with her father in Missouri, a skill she had hidden from everyone in her new life. guided her hand. The bullet hit Miller in the shoulder, making him stumble. Back. The sound of approaching horses broke the standoff. Pete, Jake, and Sam appeared on the horizon, accompanied by half a dozen other ranchers. The smoke had been seen from afar, and the community had responded. Miller and his remaining men, outnumbered and with their leader wounded, retreated, promising vengeance as they fled. Claire fell to her knees beside Thomas, tearing her skirt to make bandages. The wound was in his shoulder, bleeding heavily but not fatal if treated quickly. As she worked, tears streamed down her face, tears she hadn't shed in years. Thomas, despite the pain, raised his good hand to touch her face, wiping away her tears with his thumb. Jake Williams was the one who surprised her, offering help to carry Thomas inside, and then riding furiously to fetch the town doctor from the nearest town. The crisis had broken something in his resistance to her. While they waited for the doctor, Claire stayed by Thomas's side, holding his hand, murmuring words of comfort and half-forgotten prayers. It was during that long night, while the fever fought to take hold and the doctor worked to extract the bullet, that Thomas became delirious. He called for Margaret, asked for forgiveness for not having saved her and Emily. He spoke about the fever outbreak that took them while he was in town buying supplies. The guilt he carried for not being there, for having survived when they didn't. Claire heard it all, her heart breaking for this man who carried so much weight alone. When the fever finally broke on the third day, Thomas woke to find Claire still by his side. She had spent every hour caring for him, changing cold compresses, forcing broth between his lips, keeping vigil like a determined guardian angel. He watched her for long moments before she realized he was awake, memorizing the lines of tiredness on her face, the way the morning sun gilded her disheveled hair. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Thomas spoke about Margaret and Emily properly for the first time, not just mentioning them in passing. He told her how they met, the wedding in the small church in Austin, Emily's difficult birth that nearly took both. He spoke about the plans they had, the dreams of expanding the farm, of building a legacy to pass on, how everything had turned to ashes in just 3 days of devastating fever. Claire shared her own story, the broken engagement when she discovered the man she loved was involved with criminals in St. Louis, the threats when she refused to stay silent, the escape in the middle of the night with only what she could carry, the months on the run, always looking over her shoulder, until she saw Thomas's advertisement in an old newspaper, how something in those simple words had spoken to her, promising a refuge she desperately needed. Thomas's recovery was slow but steady. The community, galvanized by the attack, organized patrols to protect the farms. Jake Williams, in a complete reversal of his previous attitude, became one of Claire's most fervent defenders, telling everyone how she had saved Thomas and helped defend the property. The respect he had resisted giving was earned in fire and blood. During the weeks of convalescence, something fundamental changed between Thomas and Claire. The barriers he had so carefully erected began to crumble. He started smiling more, even laughing when she told stories about her misadventures trying to milk the most temperamental cow. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars and talking about everything and nothing. Margaret's garden flourished under Claire's care. The rose bush in particular responded as if waking from a long sleep. The first buds appeared one spring morning, small points of promise that made Thomas stop in his tracks. He stood there for long minutes, watching, and Claire saw the exact moment something inside him finally let go. It wasn't forgetting or betraying Margaret's memory, but acceptance that life continued, that love could bloom again even in the most unlikely soil. The second great crisis came from an unexpected direction. A lawyer from town arrived one hot afternoon, bringing papers and bad news. Apparently there was a dispute over the mineral rights to the land. A company from the east, having discovered copper deposits in the nearby hills, was claiming that the rights had been sold years ago by Thomas's father. The documents were suspicious, but the company had money for a long legal battle. Claire found Thomas in the stable that night, sitting on the hay with his head in his hands. The possibility of losing the farm, The last link to his family, to Margaret and Emily, was devastating. She sat beside him in silence, offering comfort with her presence. It was then that Thomas did something that surprised her. He leaned against her, resting his head on her shoulder, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability he had never shown before. The solution came from an improbable source. Pete, the old ranch hand, remembered that Thomas's father had been meticulous with documentation. He suggested checking the old safe in the attic, a place Thomas had avoided since taking over the farm. Together, he and Claire climbed the dusty stairs and opened the forgotten safe. Inside, among other papers, was the proof they needed. The mineral rights had never been sold, and there were documents showing that the signature on the company's papers was a forgery. The legal victory that followed was sweet, but what really mattered was what happened afterward. Thomas, energized by the fight and the prospect of a future, began making plans again. He talked about expanding the herd, about drilling a new well, about building an addition to the house. When Claire commented that these were ambitious plans for a man alone, he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race and said simply that he wasn't planning on being alone anymore. The declaration hung between them for days, unspoken but present in every look, every accidental touch. Claire waited, knowing Thomas needed to be the one to take the next step. It came on a stormy night, when lightning danced on the horizon and the air was charged with electricity. She was closing the windows against the approaching rain when he appeared behind her. The words he spoke were simple, direct like everything about him. That he loved her, that he didn't expect her to replace Margaret in his heart, but hoped to make her own space beside her, that he wanted to build a future with Claire if she would have him. Her answer was even simpler. Just yes, said against his lips when they finally kissed. The rain came down hard, washing the thirsty earth, filling the dry creeks, bringing new life to the desert. They stood there on the porch watching the transformation, hands intertwined. The kiss had sealed more than a promise. It had been the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. In the months that followed, Esperanza Ranch lived up to its name. With the threat of Miller neutralized by the authorities after evidence of his crimes on other farms, and the land rights secure, Thomas and Claire worked together to rebuild. The herd grew, the garden flourished, and the house echoed with laughter again. The wedding was simple, held in the garden they had restored together. Pete was the best man, smiling proudly like a father. Jake, Sam, and the other ranch hands formed an impromptu honor guard. The entire community attended, witnessing the union of two souls who had found in each other the healing for wounds they thought incurable. Margaret's rose bush bloomed especially beautifully that day, as if giving its blessing. Claire wore one of the flowers in her hair, pinned with the comb Thomas had carved. As they exchanged vows under the vast Texas sky, promising to face whatever the future brought together, the frontier around them seemed less hostile, less empty. 6 months had passed since that first morning when Claire had stepped down from the stagecoach, a stranger seeking refuge. Now, as she stood on the same porch where Thomas had received her with silence and suspicion, she barely recognized the place. Or rather, she recognized it perfectly, but now saw it with different eyes. It was no longer a farm dying of loneliness, but a vibrant home filled with possibility. Thomas joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Together, they watched the sun set over the plains, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, but the sound no longer seemed threatening, just part of the desert's symphony. The land that had once seemed arid and unforgiving now showed its austere beauty, its ability to nurture life even in the most difficult conditions. Claire thought of everything they had overcome. The initial distrust, the barriers erected by pain, the external dangers that had threatened to destroy the little they had. Each challenge had been a test, each shared moment of vulnerability, a brick in the foundation of what they were building together. Love, they discovered, wasn't just about grand dramatic gestures, but about the small daily moments of care and understanding. Thomas squeezed her shoulder gently, bringing her back to the present. He had changed so much in these months. The lines of pain were still there, etched onto his face by the sun and by loss, but now they were softened by lines of laughter. His eyes, once empty wells of sadness, shone with renewed purpose. He still carried Margaret and Emily in his heart, always would, but there was space now for new joy, new love. The garden behind them whispered in the afternoon breeze. The plants that had struggled to survive now flourished, living proof that even the most difficult soil could be persuaded to yield life with patience and care. It was a metaphor that wasn't lost on either of them. They had been like that garden, parched by loss and loneliness, needing only the right person to help them bloom again. A new planting season was approaching, and with it came plans and dreams. Thomas talked about adding more rooms to the house, perhaps to accommodate a growing family in the future. Claire had begun corresponding with suppliers in the east, exploring the possibility of cultivating more varied crops now that they had reliable water from the new well. The farm wouldn't just be about survival, but prosperity. Neighbors had become true friends, the crisis with Miller forging bonds that the previous isolation had prevented. Shared dinners, mutual help during harvests, community celebrations had become part of the rhythm of their lives. Claire had found not just a husband and a home, but an entire community that had accepted her as one of their own. And the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Claire allowed herself a moment of deep gratitude for the courage to answer that advertisement so many months ago, for the stubbornness that had kept her there when everything seemed hostile and impossible, for the patience to wait for Thomas to be ready to love again, for the small mercies and great miracles that had paved the way to this moment. Thomas turned to her, his eyes reflecting the same stars that were beginning to dot the sky. Without words, because some things transcended language, he pulled her closer. They stood there as night fell completely over the desert, two hearts that had learned to beat as one, two souls that had found home in each other. The original contract had been simple, practical: a woman to care for a farm, a modest salary, in exchange for hard work. But life, Claire had learned, rarely followed the terms written on paper. What Thomas truly needed, and what she had brought unknowingly, was something infinitely more valuable than working hands. It was hope. It was the courage to live again, to love again, to believe that the future could be more than a painful repetition of the past. What had she found on that isolated farm in the middle of nowhere? More than the refuge she sought. She had found a man who understood the scars life could leave, who respected her strength while protecting her vulnerability. She had found a place where her past didn't define her, where she could build something new and lasting. She had found love, not the stormy, consuming kind of her youth, but something deeper, more resilient, forged in the crucible of shared hardships. As they walked together into the house that was now truly a home, Claire cast one last look at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, the desert remained vast and severe, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding across its expanse. But here, in this small oasis they had created with sweat, tears, and love, the desert had been tamed, not conquered, because nature could never truly be conquered, but persuaded to share its secrets, to allow life to flourish. The door closed softly behind them, ending the day and beginning the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, no doubt. The frontier was unforgiving in its demands, and life here would never be easy. But tonight, as they prepared supper together in the stove-warmed kitchen, as they shared the small intimacies that had become precious, there was peace. There was contentment. There was love. The old saying said the desert bloomed only after the rain. Claire and Thomas had discovered a deeper truth. Sometimes, the desert within us bloomed when we found someone willing to be our rain, to nurture the parched places with patience and care. They had been that for each other and would continue to be, as the sun rose over the dusty plains and the wind whispered ancient secrets across the eternal land. And you, when will you let hope bloom? In your desert?